All right, welcome everybody to our fifth Slam School session tied to everyday advocacy. I hope you've hung in there with us as the fifth one. If you're seeing this for the first time, you are late to the party. Go back and watch the first one, and then the other three, and then come back to this one. My name is still Antero Garcia. I'm an assistant professor at Stanford University. Still joining me in this long slog of videos is Cathy Fleischer, professor at Eastern Michigan University. Cathy, thank you again for also persevering through these processes. But also joining us is Beth Shaum. Beth, do you want to introduce who you are?
Yes, hi. Thanks for having me, Antero and Cathy. This has been a subject that has been near and dear to my heart for quite a few years. My name is Beth Shaum. I am a middle school English teacher by training and by 10 years. And this past couple of years, I have been the K-8 librarian at my school. I'm excited to be in this new role, but it's also quite a learning process. And I'm really having a great time, going through this process and learning with all of the students at my school, not just one grade that I've been, before I was teaching just eighth grade or just sixth grade. So it's really neat to be a part of the entire school community.
Awesome, thank you. And so last time, and you weren't here with us last time, Beth, but last time we were talking about ways to do your work that are savvy. And today we're looking at what it means to do advocacy work that is sustainable. So Cathy, maybe you can start us off. What does that even mean? What are we talking about here?
It's interesting. When we first developed the everyday advocacy work, we talked about being smart, safe, and savvy. But the sustainable one is one that we sort of added late. And in some ways, I think it's the most important one because you can start to think about how to be an advocate and how to do this work for a one-shot deal. But what does it mean to do this and make it a part of your professional identity? What does it mean to make something last over time? The teachers that I've worked with who have truly made it sustainable, teachers like Beth, are teachers who are doing this over time. It's part of who they are as teachers. And they turn to the ideas they've learned about advocacy pretty easily because they just keep doing it.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I think about being sustainable and what you can do to keep this going, I think about a couple of things. One is, as we've mentioned in some of the other sessions, finding colleagues. It's really important to have those allies, to have those colleagues, to have people that you can talk to about this, whether these are people in your school or people who are outside of your school who can help you think about your situation. So that's important. Some people I know have started sort of an advocacy group at their own school. So they are working together in their school on this issue. Some people I know make an advocacy calendar, right? So you make a calendar of, this is a time I want to do some outreach with parents. This is the time I want to reach out to an administrator. This time I do something with other people in the community. So those kinds of things can help. But I think underlying all that is this message that you can't make change all at once, right? And organizers have taught me that you have to celebrate the small changes in order to sustain yourself through it all to get to the long changes. And I think that's a pretty important thing to do. So when we talk about sustainability and advocacy, we really say celebrate every small thing that you've achieved, because every small thing leads to a bigger thing.
Love
and
it.
I think by doing that, that's how you can continue to make it a part of your life, right? It doesn't have to be, I've changed everything in my school because I've done some advocacy, but it can be, I've done this small thing and this small thing has led to some change. And that inspires me to want to keep on and keep doing it.
Yeah, I love that. And you're reminding me that the way you're describing this is that advocacy work isn't an add-on to what happens in your profession, right? That it sounds like it becomes an innate part of what you do year in and year out. And it sounds like maybe, Beth, that's similar to kind of how your practice, both as a teacher and as a librarian, shapes the work that you do. Is that right?
Absolutely. I think, in terms of this whole idea of sustainability, I'm going through my notes here, and I immediately, as I was listening to Cathy talk, wrote down the word attitude, because it is about the small little things, and you can let all of the minutia of your job weigh you down, But for me to make this work sustainable, it's all about finding those small victories to, and not just to celebrate them for yourself, but to also make sure that the school community knows about them too. I often find myself, when I go to lunch in the teacher's lounge, which can often be a very toxic place. And so when I'm sitting at the table with all these teachers who need a place to vent, which I think a healthy dose of venting is good, but too much and it becomes toxic. So when I feel the air in the room start to get toxic, I remember some of those small victories, either that week or that day or maybe that month, and I try to inject a little bit of that positivity into the toxicity to remind the teachers what we're here for in the first place. So that's one of the big ways that I make the work sustainable for myself.
I love that. I think that's great. And so I feel like those are the small victories. And I want to tie a couple of things that Cathy said together, and I'm hoping maybe you'll be able to share some examples of what this has looked like for you. But Cathy mentioned, thinking about like who your colleagues are and trying to work with them, and that, that you connect with them over time. And I also recognize that, sometimes a local community can feel challenging, so there might be a broader network that you connect with. As you think about like who your colleagues are that you're engaged with in this kind of deep social justice work, how do you find out who those folks are, and do those relationships change over time?
Yeah, for me in the local community, that's been a struggle of mine this year, actually, and this is something I've been talking with even recently with Cathy about in our teacher research group. Is one way, or I have three basic ways that I've kept the work going as a school librarian, because when I took on this role last year, I was pretty much aware of the research, aware of what's going on with school libraries. Librarians are constantly fighting for their jobs. Schools are often no longer hiring librarians. So if there is a library in the school, they'll just hire aides. Or a lot of schools are just completely gutting their libraries, and so a lot of schools don't even have libraries. So I knew when I was going into this job, to make it sustainable, I had to think of ways to advocate for my job as a librarian and also for the library in general. So I've really been reaching out to parents, to students, and specifically also to my administrator, but it's been a harder sell with the teachers. And we've had kind of, for a long time, not really celebrating reading within our community. So I'm trying to find ways to do that, not just with the students, because as I mentioned to Cathy at our last teacher research meeting, the students have bought into this already. Like, I have no issues with the students. It's the teachers that have been a little bit more of a struggle, because they're more worried about, well, I got to cover this material, I've got to get this done. And so any little extra thing that I'd like to add to make reading more enjoyable can often be looked down upon, because they need to get their stuff done. So as far as the local community and the teachers and my colleagues in our building, that's been a struggle. But luckily I have the NCTE community, I have, the Twitter community to reach out to and, get some ideas from when I'm struggling.
I love that. Thanks. And thanks for sharing that example. And so the flip side is a lot of our viewers aren't librarians, right? So we can think of like allies and who our colleagues are might be, or probably could be librarians, both within our schools, within our local communities. So it's just such a useful space. And I think almost like a sister organization, NCTE and ALA are both probably aligned.
Well, and I think having been, an English teacher, and honestly, I shouldn't say been, because I say once an English teacher, always an English teacher. I still think like an English teacher. That's where my heart is. But NCTE will always be part of my life, because honestly, I think that's where librarians should be going. If librarians want their jobs to remain sustainable, they should be reaching out to those teacher organizations. They should be going to conferences like NCTE, because that's where they need to convince people that their jobs matter. Going to ALA librarians know librarians matter,
Yeah.
but we need to get the teachers on board.
Yeah, I love that example. And I think it's useful to think through the kinds of so as your career's shifted in different ways over the years, right? I think the ways that advocacy has looked and the kinds of actions you've done are probably shifted from time to time. So it's useful for us to think about, these small things from one day at a time as tied to bigger, broader issues.
Can I jump in for a second?
Yeah,
to say,
please do. Go ahead, Cathy.
So, when I think about sustainability, I also think about the role of English educators like myself. Like, what can we do to help educate pre-service teachers, practicing teachers, to see advocacy as a part of their lives? And Beth is such a beautiful example to have for this, because she was a student in a course, the very first time I taught a course in advocacy as a graduate student. And so Beth took that course in. It was, I don't want to put too many words in your mouth, Beth, so jump in. But I mean, Beth was at a crossroads then of deciding if she wanted to stay being a teacher. And the work that she did out of that class in advocacy, I think was sort of the beginning, it seemed to me, the beginning of you finding the positive and the positive reasons that you should stay. And it really just grew and grew and grew for you. I don't know if you want to talk about the project you did there and sort of where you started with all this.
Yeah, I mean, that was definitely a time where I was sort of meandering and wondering I think every teacher in the history of teaching, at least in these past 10, 15 years, has questioned whether they want to continue because of all of the mandates and all the jobs that just get piled onto us. And it's overwhelming. So I got to that point, like many of us do, and it came, your advocacy class came at the perfect time. And so, yeah, that was definitely a shifting in attitude for me, because I remember a conversation we even had in that class, because I was initially thinking of researching why teachers leave. And I think it was you that encouraged me to say, well, let's flip this around and find out why they stay instead, and try to change the narrative. And so ever since that class and ever since that moment and doing that project, that's been my goal, my mission, so to say, is to shift the narrative of teaching and to make sure that we're sharing all the positives and all of the stories that you don't get to hear, because on the news and in articles, all you hear about is standardized tests.
Yeah, so I feel like this entire principle around sustainable and both of your narratives, this linked narrative, really speaks to a question that I've been thinking about, right? So as we think about, I do a lot of work with pre-service teachers in the teaching that I do. And I wonder, how soon is too soon when it comes to advocacy work? It also seems like sustainable is a way to address feelings of burnout, which I think are particularly prevalent for new teachers. But also as you continue, I think there's an ebbing and flowing of a connection. And so I'm wondering, Cathy, when do you feel new teachers should be engaged in this work? And is there ever a time to not be engaged in this work? Yeah.
I think it's from the beginning, because when I think we talk about sustainable, we're talking about both the sustainability of being an advocate, and advocacy helping make teaching a sustainable profession.
Yep.
Right? Both. And I think from the very beginning, because I think the role of teacher has changed so dramatically. Like, it used to be that you could just go into your classroom and shut the door and teach, right? Nobody cared. And then it's been changing and changing and changing over the years. And we're at the point now where if teachers want to do the kinds of teaching that we know from National Writing Project, from NCTE, from all the research in our field really matters to students, we need to help others understand why we are teaching in this way. Because as Beth so eloquently said, that is not what the public narrative is. The public narrative has to do with tests and test scores.
Yeah. So
if we want to do this work, we have to see this as part of our new professionalism. And so I think we start with students at the beginning. One of my colleagues, I love this, one of my colleagues, John Staunton, who teaches at Eastern, and we have a writing methods class. So it's like juniors, right? Sophomores or juniors. And what he does there, he does the a genre study, does like an unfamiliar genre project, genre study as part of what he does in the class, but then he shifts it on its head. So what they're doing is genres out to the public. So they're picking a genre of how do you inform the public about what you're doing as a teacher, right? Which is a beautiful advocacy moment.
Yep.
And they're learning how to do that when they're juniors in college. I think that's only going to help them along the way. Beth has done some great work this year with photos of really demonstrating what happens in the library. So doing, this photo through, you're doing through Facebook, right?
Well, I mean, I share obviously with my friends on Facebook, who many of them are teachers, but I created a library Instagram account. So I'm sharing it with our school community. And so parents and some of the older students, like the middle school students who follow it, see all of the fun things that we're doing in the library.
And it's a really great example, right, of choosing a genre to represent what's going on there. And Beth has done a great job of that with these pictures that they're both adorable, and they just show kids really reading and writing and showing what the library can be.
I love that. I feel like in a separate kind of example, when I was still teaching in Los Angeles, we would oftentimes organize public grade-ins, right, and grade papers in public, right, to make people aware of the work of being a teacher, right, and engage in kind of advocacy work in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, I've gone to a couple of those, not organized like you, but I've gone to a couple, and it's really cool.
Yeah, it's fun, and you still get the grading done that you need to get done at some point, which I think is useful, right? As we think about all of these examples are, it's still tied to writing, and it's still tied to the kind of work that we're doing with young people or with other colleagues, and so I think it's really useful to think through how these practices are connected to one another. We're going to wrap up this conversation in a second. And I want to remind folks, if you haven't looked at everydayadvocacy.org, even though we keep harping on you to do so, go to everydayadvocacy.org. There are more resources tied to being a sustainable advocate there, as well as a review of all of the other principles we've covered so far. There is also still the Summer Institute, which is coming up. Cathy, do you want to remind us of the dates and where we can go for more information about that?
It's July 10th through 12th. And if you go to the Everyday Advocacy site, when it has opportunities, there's a link you can go to there to find it.
Awesome. And then again, we're hoping that you'll, as you watch this video, jump onto Twitter and engage in some conversations. The hashtag we're using is still #SlamEDU. And we just want to know, what are your next steps? We've gone through all 4 of these principles and done an overview of everyday advocacy. What are your steps as someone who's diving into this work and seeing yourself as a lifelong advocate for the profession and for yourself, right? I think there's a dialectic that's at work here. So what are your next steps? And Beth and Cathy and I will all be jumping in over the next week to be responding and retweeting and joining in conversations. So if you're asking for help, please do that there as well. Beth, thank you so much for joining us. Cathy, thank you, as usual. I really appreciate talking with both of you.
Thanks, Antero.
Thank you.